Um, so the question was about introductory material. Cantor Nicholson asked. No, we have it, Craig has it and is going to show us. But the first class, we're recording each class, and he put it up on our YouTube channel. So if you wanted to go back for the introductory class about wisdom literature, that was the general introduction, was last week. This week we're doing Proverbs, and then we're going to spend 2 weeks doing Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, and then we should spend about 2 weeks doing Job, and then we'll have a final kind of wrap up and see what we still need to cover. So let's start with Proverbs. One of the issues, actually Marshall raised it last week, is who wrote these things? Who actually wrote them and where do they come from? Now, Proverbs is what we're talking about today, and it is ascribed to King Solomon, who, as we read last week in the book of Kings, is described as this incredible, wise, brilliant individual who wrote 3,000 plus Proverbs and over 1,000 Psalms or songs. And rabbinic tradition always sees him as this kind of literary genius and intellectual person with great wisdom. You know, you can be an intellectual and not have wisdom. One of the questions, Marshall sent me a couple of emails this week, has to do with the difference between wisdom, knowledge, intellect, insight. I mean, all of the words that we're going to find in Proverbs are not easily defined, and the definition really changes depending on the context. But we also remind us that Hebrew, as opposed to English, is a language that works on roots and forms. What that means is one root in different forms can have many, many meanings. English is really a vocabulary intensive language. We like to add words from all kinds of sources. If you look at an unabridged dictionary, you'll see words that you've never seen in your life. You'll see hundreds of thousands of words that we never use, or they're specific to a specific discipline. Hebrew as a language really developed around a core set of roots, and therefore the context is what defines the use of a word. One word can be used in many different ways depending on that context. And that's what allows for midrash. That's what allows for commentary or interpretation, because one root can look very differently or be understood differently depending on where it falls and how the commentator or the individual who's interpreting it sees it. So Proverbs, in all probability, was not written by King Solomon. That doesn't mean that some of these Proverbs weren't written by King Solomon. We don't know. There's nothing in the book of Proverbs that gives us historical context, right? I think you guys can go on mute unless you're going to talk, because I'm hearing background noise, and I'm going to give you an opportunity in a minute. So what I'm saying is, if you read the whole book of Proverbs, which is not very interesting, because it really is just a lot of separate, many cases, separate sayings, some that are one sentence long, some that are two. There are a couple of poems that are longer, or sections that are longer, but they're not meant to be read like a book. If we were to look back in the book of Kings or the book of Samuel, or even the Torah, we can find hints about the history of that period, right? That's what archaeologists do. Biblical archaeologists look at that period, they see what is written, and when they find a city or a village, they try to see if there is a correlation. And sometimes that helps them to define an era. The stuff we're working on, Proverbs, Kohelet.
Did they change your whole?
I'm sorry, who said what? Somebody asked? Oh, someone's coming on. Gina, hi. So there's nothing in the book of Proverbs that helps us know when it was written or how it was written or what group wrote it. There's assumptions that scholars make. One assumption is that this kind of literature, proverbial literature, was common in the ancient Near East. We know it from Egypt. We see it, we have remnants of it from different Near Eastern places. In fact, it was often used to educate scribes, to teach scribes what is the proper way to act, what is the proper way to live, in order that you do this holy work of scribal arts. Because what you're writing down traditionally was always holy work. In Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in Israel, that was the work of scribes. So one of the understandings is that some of this was there to educate scribes. Now, most scholars don't believe that Israel or Jerusalem, particularly, was big enough to have a school of scribes. Solomon probably had a few scribes. That was the only way you could do business. You had to have some people that knew how to read and write. That's how the ancient world functioned. But whether they had enough to have a school that would have educated a whole class of scribes, most scholars think Jerusalem was too small at that time to have had that kind of an infrastructure. But by the time of King Hezekiah in the 8th century BCE, probably it was large enough, and under him, there probably was a group of scribes, and they may have brought together some of this material. So let me give you an idea about the structure and how this works. So Craig, if you would put up the insert, please.
There you go, Rabbi.
Okay. So let's look. This is what the book is made up of. There really are at least 7 distinct sections, and then there's the addenda. The first 9 chapters through verse 18 in the book in 9 probably were late, and they deal with the theme of wisdom. They're almost like a whole series of poems to wisdom. We're going to look at one in a minute. Then when you get to chapter 10 through basically chapter 31, verse 9, you're dealing with what most people understand to be the kind of core series of proverbs that were created in the ancient Jewish world. So you get the proverbs called Proverbs of Solomon, says that. Then in 20, thank you. Then in 22, you've got the heading, the words of the wise. That seems to be a separate section. In 24, you have these also belong to the wise, meaning these are kind of captions that seem to introduce a new little group of proverbs. In 25 to 29, it says these were written by the men, they were gathered by the men of Hezekiah. They were collected by the men of Hezekiah, was a king of Israel in the 8th century BCE and 7th century, ruled a number of years. But then we have these 2 individuals we have no record of. In chapter 30, we have this person called Agur, the son of Yakeh. There's nowhere else that he appears. Not only not in Hebrew work, but not in ancient Near East work. We don't have this. The assumption is he was a king, but we don't know who it refers to. Now, sometimes the rabbis will take that name and try to ascribe it as a different name for Solomon. They do the same with Lemuel. You look at chapter 31, you see the words of Lemuel that his mother instructed him. We don't know who Lemuel is. We have no evidence that there was a Lemuel other than this. So the rabbis try to say this is a different name for Shlomo. And there's a midrash that tries to do that. Most scholars would say these were like little sections that existed and got put together into this book called Mishle, or Proverbs. And they're like, it's like a collection, a little library of Proverbs. But then we have these two addenda. This addendum which says that there's a woman of valor, right? We're going to look at that. And there's an addendum that has numerical sayings. There are 4 kinds of. There's a whole section, a little section that deals with that. So the reality is we think that these proverbs were gathered together in the ancient world, maybe under Hezekiah, during that 8th century, 7th century, and after, that many things got added to it, and that ultimately when the Tanakh was sealed, somewhere we believe, in the, well, for sure by the 1st century CE, but maybe even a little earlier, that this book got sealed with the collections that are here. So any questions about that? About how it got formed or who wrote it? If you want to go off, just come in, take your Alice.
Where do we find the book of Proverbs?
So the book of Proverbs is right after the book of Psalms. It's in the writings, right? The Tanakh is Torah, Nevi'im, the prophets, and then Ketuvim, the writings. And writings begins with Psalms, and then Proverbs is right after it. And
Just in the Tanakh.
It's in the Tanakh. It's in our Hebrew Bible. It's in Christian Bibles too. This is part of the core of the Hebrew Bible. It's the writings, right? And we don't quote it much because it's not in our Haftarot. It's not like historical. Not only that, but as we're going to see, it's not even a book about God. Almost all of it, God is only mentioned a few times. Most of it is about human beings and the way humans should act, right? And it got another aspect that we're going to look at, which is really fascinating, and that is the role women play in the book of Proverbs, which is both very positive and in one section, very negative. Okay, any comments about that?
I have a question, Rabbi.
Yeah.
Using today's language, is it possible that the book of Proverbs or portions of the book of Proverbs were crowdsourced? In other words, there were many people who contributed because they knew that this compilation was underway.
Well, it wasn't crowdsourced in the way that we crowdsource, but a lot of the sayings were sayings. I mean, were there things, Amy, that your mother said that were like proverbs or sayings
Sure.
that your mother said many times?
Of course. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can you think of one? Any of you can think of those?
I can think about when my father always said that
Right.
some people's minds are so open that the wind blows through them.
Okay, that's good. Well, your father probably didn't make that up. He probably
Right.
heard it from somebody else and he liked it and it became a part of his language. And now you know it. And at a certain point when these books were being compiled, there were probably a lot of these proverbs floating around. We don't know who wrote them, but they were commonly used. And so they got put into this book. So in that sense, they were crowdsourced. They were passed down from teacher to student, parent to child, grandparent. They were spoken in the marketplace and people liked them. And so they lived. because we're going to find there are proverbs that contradict other proverbs. Because some proverbs have one attitude, and then another proverb will have the opposite attitude, but they both got put in, probably at different times. So we can't say there's an author to this, right? We can't, we can say there probably were maybe even hundreds of authors ultimately, but there was a compiler and there was a redactor somewhere. This all got sealed into one book, and some things got left out. Somebody made that decision somewhere. We know it within a couple of centuries when it probably happened. We don't know who, and we don't know exactly when, because it is not, it's an ahistorical book. Okay? So let's look at the B. Craig, if you could, scroll down to B. The nature of proverbial wisdom. So I'm going to ask someone to read number 1, please. Just unmute yourself and read.
Proverbs are short, pithy sayings that incorporate time-tested insights. They are meant to be used contextually. So, for example, the prophet Ezekiel cites a proverb that was popular at the time of the Babylonian exile. The parents have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge.
Okay, so what does that proverb mean? What does it mean to you?
Means that if your parents have kind of a bad attitude toward life, that will influence your children.
Well, how will it influence them? In a positive way or negative?
No, they'll be, full of anxiety. Their teeth will be set on edge.
Right, they're going to suffer for the sins of the parents, in this case, impact the life of the child, right? So, but this is a proverb in a colorful way that is meant for context. Ezekiel quotes it actually to disprove it. He doesn't buy this. He's talking about the exile of the Jewish people in Babylonia. So that's one thing. These are short, pithy statements, and they don't have a context, but they were meant for a context. They were meant to be used in a sense the way, my mother would say, if your friends jumped off a bridge, would you jump off a bridge? I mean, they're like little things that are meant to convey a lesson, right? But they need a context. You say that to a child who's just done something really stupid, right? Because his friends did it. Right, so there needs to be a context. We don't have the context for these proverbs. Okay, any comments on that before we go to 2?
Yeah, the first 20-some chapters are not the pithy comment type. They're all little, each chapter is more or less coherent, but there's about 20 to 30 verses.
Well, the first 9 chapters are those chapters which most scholars think were written later, and they really are the ones you're talking about, that are like almost little mini essays dealing with wisdom and learning. But once you get into that, they are actually meant to be sayings. If you look at, in the Hebrew, it's sometimes clearer than in the English. In the Hebrew, they are actually separate, one from the other, depending on who translates it. But most of it is really meant to be, let me just pick here. Here, false scales, this is chapter 11. False scales are an abomination to the Lord. An honest weight pleases him. That's one by itself, right? It doesn't need the next statement. The next one is when arrogance appears, disgrace follows. That's separate. They're listed one after the other, Susan, but they're not actually connected. They're really separate. They have general themes about how we should behave, but the ones at the first 9 chapters Actually, that's why many scholars think they're later, because they seem to have been composed almost as units dealing with knowledge and wisdom, those first 9 chapters. But starting with chapter 10, all the way through almost the end, we see mainly compendia of Proverbs. Okay? No, you're on mute, Susan. I see your mouth moving, but
I'm looking at chapter 23.
okay.
That
Yeah.
seems to go, at least the first 3 verses seem to go together.
Which, you're talking about the first 3 verses?
Yeah,
Oh, okay. So this happens to be one section. Some scholars believe that these are like behavior in the presence of aristocrats. Do you watch The Crown?
yeah,
Okay, so you know right now we're dealing with the new prime minister, who is Margaret Thatcher, and who's not an aristocrat, right? Who comes from a working class background and who aspires to be an aristocrat, or at least to hobnob with that group. But she always does things in the wrong way. So, and rubs the queen wrong. I mean, it rubs the queen in a wrong way because she sees her as kind of a wannabe. Well, these are, many scholars believe, these are instructions to scribes how to behave in the presence of a ruler when you're invited to eat or to be with that ruler.
uh-huh,
So these happen to be the first ones here. When you sit down to dine, consider well who is before you, thrust a knife into your gullet. If you have a large appetite, do not crave for his dainties, for they are counterfeit food. I mean, these are all instructions about how to behave. It's almost like Dear Abby, or Ann Landers. You know, it's this is the proper way to behave. But that section is just there. But then it has, the next words are, do not toil to gain wealth. Have the sense to desist. You see it, then it's gone. That is a statement. That is a proverb.
yeah,
Then it goes on, it grows wings and flies away like an eagle heavenward. But then you get back to the food. These little sections are proverbs. They're just longer than one tiny statement.
right,
They're 3 or 4 sentences. Okay?
yeah.
All right, let's look at 2. Who would like to read this?
I'll read. Perhaps the most fundamental objective of proverbial wisdom is simply to make observations. Several sayings have the character of simple propositional statements. Anxiety weighs down the human heart, but a good word cheers it up. Hope deferred makes the heart sick. The numerical sayings in chapter 30 are likewise attempts to observe and categorize phenomena. 4 things are small, but exceedingly wise: ants, badgers, locusts, the lizard. 4 are stately in their gait: the lion, the rooster, the he-goat, and the king. There is an element of humor in noting the similarity between His Majesty and the farmyard fowl.
Right, and we have to remember some of this stuff would be funny. If we took it seriously, they're comparing a rooster to the king. I don't know that a king would be flattered by being compared to a rooster or a he-goat, right? Maybe a lion, but what they're doing is, part of the Proverbs is to observe what should be obvious. Anxiety weighs down the human heart, but good cheer cheers you up. There's nothing brilliant about that, right? I think we would say that's common sense. Or hope deferred makes the heart sick, right? You know, these are things that are just observations. And the numerical statements are often observations that people have. Some people argue, by the way, about the numerical statements, that they're meant to be riddles, right? Name four things, what four things are stately in their gait? You know, it's trivia. So there's an answer. There are riddles and answers. But they're here as kind of a little section almost of trivia. It's almost like bar bets. You know what bar bets are? You know things. One of the more famous ones is if I can tell you where you got those shoes, will you give me $1? And the guy sitting next to him says, what are you saying? You're going to tell me where I got my shoes? Yeah, I'll tell you where you got your shoes. If I can tell you exactly where you got your shoes, will you give me $1? And they make the bet. And the answer is, you got those shoes here in this bar on your feet. Give me $1. That's a bar bet, right? There's an answer that's obvious that the person doesn't see. So these are almost like those bar bets. Here are some riddles. Use them. Take these riddles, go out there and say, what four things are small but wise? Bet somebody if they can answer it. Okay, let's look at 3. Got a reader for 3?
Observational sayings implicitly appeal to experience. In most cases, these observations were passed on from father to son or from teacher to student and accepted on the authority of tradition. Psalm 37:25, or Proverbs, is it? Or Psalm?
No, it's Psalms.
Okay, 37:25 claims, I have been young and now I'm old, yet I have never seen the righteous forsaken or their children begging bread.
So the reason that was from Psalms is it actually is quoting a proverb. But it can't, I mean, how is that possible? Who is old and has never seen a righteous person's children begging for bread? How is that even possible? The notion that because someone is righteous, their children will never want for bread, but it is a statement. It's a proverb, and it was used there. Joni, if you would go on.
Riches do not profit in the day of wrath, but righteousness delivers from death.
Does righteousness deliver from death?
No.
Everybody dies, right? But the rabbis will interpret it that tzedakah tatzil mimavet. That's what the phrase is. Charity delivers from death, meaning that it is a way of averting a death sentence if you give charitably. So if you give charitably, you won't die this year or tomorrow. That there is a connection between doing tzedakah and remaining alive. Okay, what else?
But none of these observations claims to derive from revelation or any kind of authority. This is human and open to verification and dispute. It can also be insightful, humorous, and target. See, for example, the description of the drunkard in 23:29-35.
So I'm going to read a little of that. 23:29. So this is about someone who drinks too much wine. Who cries, woe? Who, alas? Who has quarrels? Who complaints? Who has wounds without cause? Who has bleary eyes? Those whom wine keeps till the small hours, those who gather to drain the cups. Do not ogle that red wine as it lends its color to the cup. As it flows on smoothly, in the end, it bites like a snake. It spits like a basilisk. Your eyes will see strange sights. Your heart will speak distorted things. You will be like one lying in bed on high seas, like one lying on top of the rigging. They struck me, but I felt no hurt. They beat me, but I was unaware. As often as I wake, I go after it again. So this is kind of a funny, it's kind of a humorous way of saying, don't drink too much, because you're going to be like this guy who is being beaten and doesn't feel it, who's bleary-eyed, right? So it is a proverb, but it's kind of a description in that case about not drinking. Comments, questions about that? About any of that? Sorry for you wine drinkers. Just gotta, in moderation, right? In moderation. Okay, let's go to 4. Who would like to do this one?
I'll read, Rabbi.
Thank you, Craig.
The ethical teaching of Proverbs is problematic. On the one hand, there is a tendency to blame the poor for their condition and to assume that poverty is the result of laziness. 10:4, negligent hands cause poverty, but diligent hands enrich. 13:18, poverty and humiliation are for him who spurns discipline, but he who takes reproof to heart gets honor.
So there is a strain within Proverbs that poverty is the result of lack of something. It could be, laziness, lack of discipline, but it's the fault of the person who's poor. And then,
Yet Proverbs also warns frequently against oppressing the poor. Those who oppress the poor insult their maker, but those who are kind to the needy honor him. 14:31. Whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord and will be repaid in full.
so on the one hand, it's a negative view of poor people. On the other hand, these other Proverbs are asking us to honor poor people. Now, if it's their fault, if they could pick themselves up out of poverty just by working, why would we honor them? But we honor them because God wants us to. And this is one of the few times that they call on God in a reflection of a proverb. You see, so Proverbs themselves are not necessarily consistent, right? Because again, they came at different times from different sources and different context. They are a compendium, and you can pick out the ones that work for you. Okay, let's go to 5.
God guarantees the cosmic order, which ensures that the chain of cause and effect takes its course. The eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good. 15:3. Proverbs has no place for miraculous interventions in history, nor does it encourage prayer for extraordinary deliverance. God sees to it that nature takes its course.
Now, this is pretty remarkable in the Tanakh, right? We're not asked to pray in Proverbs. It's not dependent on miracles or even on God. God's role is almost like panentheism, or which is a much more modern, medieval and modern concept, or naturalism. God makes sure that things keep moving in a natural way. God watches evil and good. God doesn't intervene, right? It's really pretty interesting that the book of Proverbs doesn't ask us to depend on God or to beseech God. It all talks about our actions. I mean, I think that's pretty remarkable. Why would you? We're going to see with all of our 3 books, the question arises, why is it even in the Tanakh? What do they need this for? They've got all this other literature. How much does this add to the wisdom we already have? And doesn't it seem to be at odds with the general approach of the earlier sections, particularly the Torah and even the prophets, where God is clearly the center and we are to respond to God? This is not about halacha. This is not about God's requirements for us. This is not about even the way we relate to God so much as it is the way we relate to each other.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Going back to the last one about people who are poor,
Yeah,
I mean, if you take that for today's environment, what our country has done to Black people has pushed them into poverty and not provided what would help them.
right.
And so I disagree with that. I mean, I guess there are those few who have made it and, said, I'm not going to be held down.
Right.
But too many of them, they're brought up in an environment where they don't have a chance.
Well, so you disagree with that proverb?
Yeah.
I understand. I would disagree with it too. I think there are people who have given up. That's true. But there also are people who work their fingers to the bone and remain poor all their lives. Right? There are people who just, for whatever reason, background, education, family values, their own personal issues, their physical issues, their health issues, they work, they try, and they don't get ahead. Well, so then you don't pick that proverb as one of yours. Well, I'm saying Proverbs is not, it's harmonious. It's not a book of, in fact, we're going to see this in some ways with the other two books as well. They are not meant to be a single approach. This one particularly is meant to be a whole series of different sayings from different contextual moments that have been put together into a compendium. And you pick the ones that mean something to you. That's why it's not quoted that much in our literature. Right? Okay. So now let's get to some women. So one of the most intriguing features is Proverbs chapters 1-9, which is what Susan talked about, because wisdom is personified as a woman. So let's read this. This is Proverbs chapter 1, beginning at verse 20, where wisdom cries aloud in the streets. So I need a reader for that.
Okay. Wisdom cries aloud in the streets, raises her voice in the squares. At the head of the busy streets, she calls. At the entrance of the gates, in the city, she speaks out. How long will you simple ones love simplicity? You scoffers, be eager to scoff. You dullards hate knowledge. You are indifferent to my rebuke. I will now speak my mind to you and let you know my thoughts. Since you refused me when I called and paid no heed when I extended my hand, you spurned all my advice and would not hear my rebuke. I will laugh at your calamity and mock when terror comes upon you.
Okay. Before I ask the question, I do want to point out that this is the equivalent of today saying there are no, all science is false. And when a pandemic comes on us, wisdom mocks us for not listening to science, to wisdom, to facts. But I want to know the question. I want you to think about, why is wisdom personified as a woman? It's her all the way through. Why?
One source says that it's because the woman signifies Torah.
And in what way does woman signify Torah?
You got me. I mean, it's an allegory, or it's a way to think about it. That it's not a woman. It's that the woman means something else, and maybe Torah is a feminine noun or whatever, but that it stands for that form of knowing.
Okay, so first of all, Torah is a feminine noun. Chokhmah, wisdom, is a feminine noun, but they're going further than that. They actually, if you read in the Hebrew, it actually is saying she raises her voice, right? It uses the feminine that it doesn't have to. There's no reason why it had to carry on this metaphor of wisdom as being a female figure. Now, there are scholars who've attempted to say that there was a female goddess in early Canaanite or biblical tradition that fell out, and she ended up being wisdom, in effect, like the goddess of wisdom. But there's no evidence anywhere else in the Tanakh for that. It's really speculation. But what is fascinating is throughout Proverbs, in those first 9 chapters, it clearly is seeing women in an incredibly positive way. And that's not true all the way through Tanakh. It's seeing women as wisdom, and wisdom is the core of what the Torah and what the Tanakh is all about. It's not just knowledge. You know, Marshall, when you asked the question about the difference, if I take chapter 1 of Proverbs and I look at just the first sentences after the Proverbs of Solomon, king, son of David, king of Israel, here are the words in Hebrew that all can mean something about knowledge. Da'at, Chochmah, Musar, Bina, Haskel, Tzedek, Mishpat, Umesharim. All of those words have some, and there are more. There's Mazima, which is insight. I mean, all of these are words that actually mean some form of learning or knowledge or wisdom, of taking in, but it's not just facts. It's about how we use the facts. It's wisdom. And wisdom is about some element that is beyond knowledge. Because there are many people who are knowledgeable that are not wise. And there are people without a lot of knowledge that are wise. Wisdom seems here to be the core. And I'm wondering to some degree, now, of course, there's the tradition that Solomon is talking about his mother Bathsheba. Because if Solomon wrote it, what woman would he see as this wise woman? He had 300 wives and 700 concubines. So it wouldn't be them, right? But it would be potentially Bathsheba, who actually manipulated King David into naming Solomon as the next king. There's a whole section in the Tanakh that shows her work in bringing in Solomon as the successor king. But I think it is fascinating that a woman is seen as the personification of wisdom. So let's look at the last 2 female figures. So Craig, if you would go down. Okay. There's this figure of an Isha Zara, a strange woman. And she's introduced in chapter 2, but the most elaborate section is the one I've quoted here from chapter 7. So let's get a reading on that, please.
My son, heed my words and store up my commandments with you. Keep my commandments and live. My teaching is the apple of your eye. Bind them on your fingers. Write them on the tablet of your mind. Say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call understanding a kinswoman. She will guard you from a forbidden woman, from an alien woman whose talk is smooth, from the window of my house.
Craig, yes, thank you.
Through my lattice, I looked out and saw among the simple, noticed among the youths, a lad devoid of sense. He was crossing the street near her corner, walking toward her house in the dusk of the evening, in the dark hours of the night. A woman comes toward him dressed like a harlot with set purpose. She is bustling and restive. She is never at home. Now in the street, now in the square, she lurks at every corner. She lays hold of him and kisses him, and brazenly she says to him, I had to make a sacrifice of well-being. Today, I fulfilled my vows. Therefore, I have come out to you, seeking you, and I have found you. I have decked my couch with covers of dyed Egyptian linen. I have sprinkled my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Let us drink our fill of love till morning. Let us delight in amorous embrace. For the man of the house is away. He is off on a distant journey.
Okay.
A woman of valor.
Well, that's the next one. So here we have these two women who, remember the first, we have the woman who is personification of wisdom. And here you have what seems to be a woman, maybe a mother, a teacher, talking to her son and saying, this is what some women can be like. And they describe this Isha Zara, this strange woman. So here we have one case, a woman described in very positive terms. And then we have this very specific sexual scene, including the fact that her husband is on a journey away from home. And so she set this whole thing up. And there's this woman who is dressed like a harlot and is an Isha Zara, a strange woman. Then we have the Eshet Chayil, which is all in the same book in Proverbs. We have these, and we're going to look at her now, because she, in some ways, she's not wisdom, but she's in some ways the opposite, or at least she certainly is in contrast to this Isha Zara. Okay. This is a famous one. Got a reader?
A woman of valor, who can find? She is more precious than corals. Her husband places his trust in her and profits only thereby. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. She seeks out wool and flax and cheerfully does the work of her hands. She is like the trading ships, bringing food from afar. She gets up while it is still night to provide food for her household and a fair share for her staff. She considers a field and purchases it and plants a vineyard with the fruit of her labors. She invests herself with strength and makes her arms powerful. She senses that her trade is profitable. Her light does not go out at night. She stretches out her hands to the distaff and her palms hold the spindle. She opens her hands to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. She has no fear of the snow, for her household, for all her household is dressed in fine clothing. She makes her own bedspreads. Her clothing is of fine linen and luxurious cloth. Her husband is known at the gates, where he sits with the elders of the land. She makes and sells linen. She supplies the merchants with sashes. She is robed in strength and dignity, and she smiles at the future. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and a lesson of kindness is on her tongue. She looks after the conduct of her household and never tastes the bread of laziness. Her children rise up and make her happy. Her husband praises her. Up, Greg, up.
Greg? You can move it up a little? Thank you.
Yes. Wait a minute, I lost the place. Where am I here? Did I get past Sashers? Yeah. She's
you
robed.
did.
Last three lines.
To her children rise up.
Her children rise up and make her happy. Her husband praises her. Many women have excelled, but you excel them all. Grace is elusive and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears God, she shall be praised. Give her credit for the fruit of her labors and her achievements, praise at her gates, and now give me dinner.
Now, when is that traditionally said?
On Friday nights.
Right, every Friday night, traditionally, the male of the household says it to his wife. The children are blessed, and the woman of the house is blessed with these words. And they are usually, in fact, there's a melody to it that in the Ashkenazic tradition is very often sung as part of it. This is an acrostic. So, if you look at the Hebrew, you would see that Eshet is Aleph. Eshet Chayil Mimtza V'Rachok Mipninim Bira Batach. Then Batach is Bet. Gmalatu is Gimel. So this is an acrostic. It is a poem. It was composed. But so here we have now these three different images of women, which really the Proverbs does spend far more time on women than the other books. It seems to have a real need to focus on aspects of women, both good, well, mostly good, but also the negative, and use that as kind of a way of teaching. So what is this one saying about the woman, the Eshet Chayil?
Perfect.
Is she perfect?
She does everything that she needs to. I mean, and more so.
Right. Well, but is she a traditional woman?
I kind of see this as, every woman, like every man. It seems that the one that I read, the Isha Zara, that seems to be one kind of portrayal. But Eshet Chayil seems to be many different options for a woman to lead a holy life. Many different areas in which she can express living a good life.
Right.
It seems less personal somehow.
Mean less specific,
Yes.
right?
Well,
Right.
very specific, but in many different directions.
Okay.
Many options.
But look at the descriptions of what she does. Is this a traditional balabust? Is this how you think of a Yiddish mama? Really? I mean, she's doing business,
Yeah.
buying fields and selling them. She's working with merchants. She's not only doing the kind of normative things, Marshall joked about now make dinner, but she is not only making dinner and making clothes, she's doing all the work. She's doing business.
That's what my grandmother did.
Your grandmother was that.
Yes, then she did both. She
Right.
did business and she did all the other stuff.
My grandmother too, because what
Wow.
choice did they have?
Yeah,
To work with my grandfather.
yeah, and schmatas.
Well, so mine was in fruit,
Right.
vegetables. They sold fruit and vegetables.
But
No,
my
but-
point is that sometimes women are like that. I mean, you were trying to say, well, is anybody really? Sometimes they're like that.
Right. Well, and what it's saying is, very often when I first became a rabbi, many of the women who were older would say to me, when I die, don't you dare use Eshet Chayil at my funeral. Because there was a history that every time a woman died, they would use Eshet Chayil. In other words, it didn't matter whether she was an Eshet Chayil or not. She could be the worst human being, and Eshet Chayil would be there. And so I was actually, some of them even wrote it into their instructions for their funerals that you are forbidden, the rabbi is forbidden to use Eshet Chayil. And it was only later in my rabbinate that I could start using it again, because most people had lost kind of the connection with it, and therefore nobody really knew. It was sort of like when I first became a rabbi, in Reform, nobody wanted to put earth on the grave. In fact, they wouldn't even lower the coffin. I don't know if Alice, if you remember this when you were young in Reform, but they would walk away with the coffin up and they wouldn't put any earth on. They often put a rose or a flower, but they wouldn't put earth on. And toward the end of my rabbinate, we were filling in graves with shovels, right? Because that generation that had seen it when they were young and traumatized them, right? They were no longer around. And the generation that had been raised without that thought it was kind of cool. This is a good thing to bury someone. And so now we have a generation that thinks these customs are really very meaningful. When I first became, I was remembering because Joni and I were talking about a couple from Worcester who've had some very difficult times. And her son was one of my first bar mitzvahs there. And she was a little more traditional. And she had asked me to say a Misha Berach. I had never said a Misha Berach. Because in Cincinnati, where I had been the assistant rabbi, nobody said a Misha Berach. Nobody used that prayer. In fact, in the Reform movement, I wasn't even taught it at school, and I don't know that anybody ever used it.
Until Debbie Friedman wrote a song.
No, well, that's what made it widespread. That's what caught on. But she asked me to do a Misha Berach. So I went and looked at what a Misha Berach was, and I did it. And I got criticism from my leadership after. We're not Orthodox. We don't do that. Because that was the state of Reform at that time. Now, if you skip a Misha Berach, we're going to hear it, right? There's been a whole change. So Eshet Chayil has changed along with the times. And what's fascinating is the word Chayil. Do you know what a Chayal is?
But like a Vilda Chaya?
No, that's a Chaya. That's an animal, a wild animal. A Chaya, living thing. It's a wild animal. No, an Eshet Chayil, a Chayal is a soldier. A Chayil is a strong woman like a soldier, right? And Eshet Chayil is a woman of power. Valor, right, is something that's in the battlefield. Person of valor, right? So an Eshet Chayil is actually describing a very strong woman, which is why one of the traditions is that Solomon wrote it about his mother, Bathsheba. So we now, much more often, we use it when the woman is that kind of a woman, a really a strong woman. It's very appropriate. It's a wonderful piece. Anyway, any comments or questions as we're wrapping this one up?
I would like to ask a question. There have been a few times when I've seen some kind of a connection between Pirkei Avot and this. And then there have been other times when I've said, no, that's a silly idea. But I'm just wondering if the rabbis of Pirkei Avot got some of their inspiration from these. Was this compiled before the Mishneh period?
Yeah, no, you're right, actually. Your instinct was exactly right. The Pirkei Avot is the rabbinic extension of this concept. How do you teach students the right way to live beyond what the halacha is? What wisdom? Let's give them some wisdom. And they took sayings from different rabbis and they compiled them into this book, which is also a compendium of that covers a couple of hundred years, actually more like 300 years of different sayings. And that became part of the Mishnah. And so it became a part of our tradition, just the way Proverbs is a part of the Tanakh, right? It was a series of disconnected sayings from various rabbis that were wise sayings. In that case, they quote the rabbis. The difference in Proverbs is, other than Solomon and these other guys that we don't know who they are, Lemuel, basically they don't quote anybody. We don't know where they came from. And they may not have known. They may have by then just been sayings of the folk sayings of the people. But yes, Pirkei Avot is exactly that.
So when you translate these proverbs, can they be interpreted in many, many different ways because of the nature of Hebrew, or are they pretty straightforward, or does it depend which ones?
Well, if you go on to Sefaria and you pull up Proverbs, it will have some commentators. It has Rashi on some of it, but there's not a lot of controversy in it. It's not like Song of Songs, where the whole issue is they translate Song of Songs, the commentators make it into a love story between Israel and God, and not a man and a woman. So there's a lot of commentary. And that's why you have a midrash, that really does that. Mishlei has some of it, but it's not that controversial in the same way. But there are commentaries on it, and they do interpret some of the lines, and they interpret them differently, and they discuss them. It's not one of the books that scholars spend a lot of time on. Kohelet, which we'll look at next week, is much more of a controversy. And then Job, in some ways, is the most controversial, and in other ways, has been misinterpreted in order to make it part of the canon. Same is true with Kohelet. You have to ignore a lot or reinterpret a lot to say it blends in with the rest of the Tanakh. But I'm arguing to some degree that these books do not blend in with the Tanakh. They are in fact the proof that they were much more open-minded than many of today's Orthodox. That those who compiled these holy books into the Tanakh were willing to tolerate different views that disagreed with each other wildly. And they put them all together into this holy book and were willing to live with it. As the Talmud has tremendous disagreement, and the Mishnah, almost everything has that. It's just right now, there's kind of a pulling back in part of orthodoxy that's made it much more rigid. Even in my what is it now, 46 years as a rabbi, orthodoxy has moved to the right very rapidly. Things that I did with Orthodox rabbis in my first 10 years, we can't even begin to do that in the last 20 years. It's just, right now it's a very narrowing of that world. And then we have the political problem that the Orthodox world has now moved into, by and large, the Republican sector and the right-wing Israeli sector, and non-Orthodoxy remains still largely in the liberal Democrat and more liberal wing of Zionism. And that is very distinct. I mean, the voting, if you see the voting patterns in every election, but this one even more so, it was something like 83% of Orthodox voted for President Trump, and something like 77% of non-Orthodox voted for President Biden. So, or President-elect Biden, I should say. Anyway.
Rabbi, would you think that part of the reason for that is the movement of the reform movement growing so much more in popularity and much more than it was years ago? When I was growing up, it was a small part of it.
It's far more complicated than that, Marty. I don't know that we have time for it, but in brief, there's a lot of discomfort among the Orthodox, just as there is among the evangelicals and some Catholics, about the liberalization in the country of same-sex marriage, marijuana and drug being legalized, of
Mhm.
the whole move toward what they see as a left move that they are uneasy with, anti-religion. The whole issue of trying to define church state more rigidly, and they identify more with that other side. They do see reform as an issue. They believe we're going to go out of existence because they believe we'll assimilate out of existence. They're not so worried about us. They're much more worried about what it imposes on them. This whole lockdown thing
Yeah.
is really, really upset them because they believe that davening in community is what God requires of them, and the government is prohibiting it. From their standpoint, that is dangerous. That is fascism. That's as bad as putting them into jail, right? There's increasingly uneasiness among a larger section of the right-wing Orthodox. And it's just part of this kind of general split that's happening not only in our country, it's very different in Israel. In Israel, it's political. It's not religious so much in Israel.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I would think
okay.
that. I would think
Bye,
that.
everybody. See you in December 2nd.
All right, thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
Craig.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Stay well,
Giving.
everybody.
Two. Bye-bye.
Does class happen once every 2 weeks on Wednesdays
Okay.
at 6:30?
It's not every 2 weeks, but it's 2 times every month. So it's December 2nd, and then I think the 18th.